something profound happening in our generation that we need to address with absolute honesty. We've become so terrified of silence that we fill every moment with noise. We scroll through our phones at 2 a.m. not because we're looking for something, but because we're running from someone ourselves. We've mastered the art of being surrounded by people while feeling completely alone. And we've convinced ourselves that the solution is to find the right person, the right group, the right community to complete us. But what if I told you that the very thing you're running from is the gateway to a dimension of fulfillment? Most people never discover. There was a man I heard about who lived in one of the busiest cities in the world, New York. He had everything our culture tells us we need to be happy. A corner office on the 43rd floor, invitations to exclusive events every weekend, a contact list with over 2,000 names. And yet, every single night, he would sit in his luxury apartment and feel a hollowness that no amount of social activity could fill. He wasn't lonely because he lacked people. He was lonely because he had never learned to be at peace with himself. One day, after a particularly exhausting week of networking events and social obligations, he made a decision that everyone thought was insane. He canceled everything for an entire month. No meetings, no social gatherings, no dates, nothing. Just him, his apartment, and the terrifying prospect of his own company. The first 3 days were absolute torture. He said it felt like withdrawal from a drug. He didn't know he was addicted to the drug of distraction, the drug of external validation, the drug of never having to face who he really was beneath all the performance. He would reach for his phone 100 times a day, not to call anyone specific, but just to feel connected to something outside of himself. But he persisted. By the end of that month, something remarkable had happened. He discovered that the person he'd been avoiding all these years himself was actually someone worth knowing. He found interests he'd abandoned because they weren't social enough. He reconnected with dreams he'd buried because they didn't fit the image he was trying to project. He realized that happiness wasn't something he needed to chase through others. It was something he could cultivate from within. Now, I'm not telling you that story to suggest you become a hermit or cut off all your relationships. That's not wisdom. That's fear in a different costume. What I'm revealing to you is a principle that transforms everything. The quality of your relationship with others will never exceed the quality of your relationship with yourself. You cannot give what you don't have. You cannot offer genuine connection when you are disconnected from your own soul. You cannot love others freely when you haven't learned to be at peace in your own presence. Think about this carefully. When you're constantly seeking external validation, constantly needing someone else to make you feel whole, constantly terrified of being alone with your thoughts, what are you really saying? You're declaring that you by yourself are not enough. You're announcing to the universe that your own company is something to be avoided, that who you are in silence is somehow deficient. And here's what happens with that mindset. You attract relationships based on neediness rather than wholeness. You make decisions from a place of desperation rather than clarity. You tolerate behaviors you shouldn't tolerate because the alternative, being alone, feels like a fate worse than death. But there's another way to exist in this world. There's a dimension of living where solitude becomes sanctuary rather than sentence, where being alone transforms from something you endure into something you actually treasure. And the pathway to this dimension begins with a fundamental shift in perspective. Your aloneness is not a problem to be solved. It's a capacity to be developed. Let me say that again, because religious and cultural conditioning has programmed us to think otherwise. Your ability to be alone, to be at peace in your own presence, to find joy in solitude, this is not a weakness or a social deficiency. It's actually one of the highest forms of emotional and spiritual maturity you can achieve. The person who needs constant company to feel okay is still an emotional infant, regardless of their age or accomplishments. The person who can stand in their own presence without distraction, without judgment, without the desperate need for external validation. That person has accessed a frequency of peace that most people spend their entire life searching for in all the wrong places. There's a woman I encountered whose story illustrates this beautifully. She had just ended a 7-year relationship, not because there was abuse or betrayal, but because she finally admitted to herself that she'd never actually been alone in her adult life. She'd gone from her parents' house to college roommates to moving in with her boyfriend at 22. She was 31 years old and had never spent a single night in a space that was entirely her own. Everyone told her she was making a mistake, that she should immediately get back out there and start dating, that her biological clock was ticking. But something inside her knew that she couldn't build a healthy relationship with another person when she'd never built one with herself. The first 6 months were harder than she expected. She would wake up on Saturday mornings with complete freedom and feel paralyzed by it. She realized she didn't actually know what she enjoyed doing because she'd spent so many years accommodating other people's preferences. She didn't know if she liked quiet mornings or energetic ones, if she preferred cooking elaborate meals or simple ones, if she was naturally introverted or had just been performing extroversion, because that's what was expected. She had to learn everything about herself as if she were meeting a stranger. And in many ways she was. But here's where the transformation occurred. As she learned to sit with herself, as she stopped running from silence, as she began to actually listen to her own thoughts and desires without immediately seeking someone else's opinion or approval, she discovered a depth within herself she didn't know existed. She found that she had opinions she'd never voiced, dreams she'd never pursued, and a whole internal world she'd never explored because she was too busy managing other people's emotions and expectations. By the end of that year alone, she had become so comfortable in her own presence that when she did eventually enter into a new relationship, it was from a place of choice rather than need, from overflow rather than emptiness. This is what I need you to understand. Happiness in solitude doesn't mean you prefer isolation to connection. It means you're no longer dependent on external circumstances to access peace. It means you've developed such a rich internal world that being alone is no longer something you fear, but something you actually value. It means you can enjoy deep, meaningful relationships without losing yourself in them, because you've established a strong center that remains constant regardless of who's around you. Most people approach relationships like someone who's drowning approaches a lifeguard with desperate clinging energy that actually makes the rescue harder. They grab onto others not from a place of love but from a place of terror, and then they wonder why their relationships feel suffocating. But when you learn to swim in your own emotional waters, when you develop the capacity to save yourself, you can then swim alongside others, not because you need them to keep you afloat, but because you genuinely enjoy their company. That's the difference between neediness and love, between dependency and genuine connection. Now, let me share something that might challenge you. One of the reasons we're so afraid of being alone is because we've been conditioned to believe that constant activity equals productivity, that being busy equals being important, that having a full social calendar equals being loved. We've bought into a culture that treats silence as emptiness and solitude as punishment. We've been taught that if you're home on a Friday night by yourself, something must be wrong with you. If you enjoy your own company more than large social gatherings, you must be antisocial. If you need time alone to recharge, you must be difficult or high maintenance. But what if all of that is backward? What if the ability to be alone is actually a sign of strength, not weakness? What if preferring depth over breadth in relationships is wisdom, not snobbery? What if needing time in solitude to process and recharge is self-awareness, not selfishness? I want to tell you about a young entrepreneur who built a multi-million-dollar company before he was 30. From the outside, his life looked like the definition of success. constant travel, speaking engagements, networking events, dinner parties with influential people. His calendar was booked months in advance, and he wore his busyness like a badge of honor, but inside he was crumbling. He realized one day that he couldn't remember the last time he'd had an original thought. Everything in his mind was either a response to someone else's agenda or preparation for the next meeting, the next pitch, the next performance. He'd become so externally focused that he'd lost touch with the internal compass that had guided him in the first place. The breaking point came during a conference in Dubai. He was surrounded by hundreds of successful, influential people, but he felt more isolated than he'd ever felt in his life. Not because they were unkind, but because he realized he didn't even know who he was anymore. Outside of his business persona, he caught a flight home that night, cleared his entire schedule for the next 3 months, and did something radical. He went to a cabin in Montana with no internet, no phone service, no way for the outside world to reach him. Everyone thought he'd lost his mind. His investors were panicking. His team thought the company would fall apart. But what happened in those 3 months changed everything. In the silence, away from all the noise and demands and expectations, he began to hear his own voice again. He started writing not business plans or marketing strategies, but just stream of consciousness thoughts about who he was, what he actually valued, what kind of life he wanted to build. He realized that he'd been climbing a ladder of success that was leaning against the wrong wall. He'd been pursuing achievements that looked impressive to others but felt hollow to him. And in that solitude, he made decisions about his business and his life that he never would have made amid all the chaos. When he returned, everything was different. Not because his circumstances had changed dramatically, but because he had changed. He restructured his entire company around his values. Rather than market expectations, he said no to opportunities that didn't align with his purpose, even when they came with big financial incentives. He built margin into his life for solitude, for thinking, for being, rather than just doing. And remarkably, his business didn't suffer. It actually thrived because it was now being led by someone who was clear, centered, and operating from authentic desire rather than fear-based ambition. This is the power of learning to be happy alone. It's not about rejecting community or relationship. It's about developing such a strong internal foundation that you can engage with the world from wholeness rather than hunger, from purpose rather than pressure, from peace rather than panic. You see, when you're comfortable in your own presence, you stop making decisions based on what will make you look good to others and start making decisions based on what's actually true for you. When you are at peace in solitude, you stop tolerating toxic relationships out of fear of being alone. When you've cultivated joy in your own company, you stop seeking validation from people who don't have your best interest at heart. This single shift from neediness to wholeness, from dependency to self-sufficiency, will transform every area of your life. Here's what nobody tells you about the journey to happiness in solitude. It will reveal everything you've been using relationships to hide from. Every uncomfortable truth you've been avoiding. Every unhealed wound you've been covering up with busyness. Every fear you've been drowning out with noise. All of it surfaces when you stop running. And this is exactly why most people never take this journey. It's not that they don't have time to be alone. It's that they are terrified of what they'll find when they finally stop moving. There's a particular story that captures this with stunning clarity. I came across a documentary about a man who worked as a sound engineer in Los Angeles. His entire career was built around noise concerts, movie productions, recording studios. He spent every single day surrounded by sound at levels that would damage most people's hearing, but he loved it. Or at least he thought he did. When he turned 45, he began experiencing severe health issues that his doctors traced back to stress and chronic fatigue. They gave him an ultimatum: take a complete break from work for at least 6 months, or face serious long-term consequences. For the first time in 23 years, this man found himself with nothing to do and nowhere to be. He rented a small house in rural Oregon, far from the city, far from the industry, far from everything that had defined his identity. And then something happened that shocked him to his core. Without the constant assault of sound, without the perpetual motion of his career, without the identity he'd built around being the guy who works on major productions, he fell apart completely. He would sit in that quiet house and feel waves of anxiety so intense he thought he was having heart attacks. He couldn't sleep because the silence felt oppressive. He couldn't concentrate on anything because his mind, accustomed to constant external stimulation, didn't know how to function in stillness. But here's where the story gets interesting. About 2 months into this forced solitude, something shifted. He stopped fighting the silence and started listening to it. He stopped trying to fill every moment with distraction and started allowing himself to simply be. And in that space, he began to hear something he hadn't heard in decades: his own inner voice. Not the voice of his ego telling him what he should do to impress others. Not the voice of fear telling him what could go wrong. But a catch-up of a deeper voice that knew things about him that he'd forgotten. That voice reminded him that when he was 17, before he got into the music industry, he used to write poetry. He'd written hundreds of poems that he'd hidden away because they didn't fit the image of who he was supposed to become. That voice reminded him that he'd always been fascinated by astronomy, but he'd abandoned that interest because it wasn't practical or profitable. That voice reminded him that he dreamed of teaching, of mentoring young people who were trying to find their way in creative fields, but he'd been too busy chasing the next big project to make time for it. In that silence, stripped of all the external markers of success, he rediscovered who he actually was beneath all the performance. And when those 6 months were over, he didn't go back to his old life. He couldn't. He tasted something in that solitude that was more valuable than any career achievement. He tasted authenticity. He experienced what it felt like to live from the inside out rather than the outside in. He eventually did return to work, but in a completely different capacity. He started a small non-profit teaching underprivileged kids about sound engineering and music production. He published a collection of his poetry. He spent his evenings stargazing and his mornings in meditation. His income dropped by 70%, but his happiness increased by what he described as infinity. This is the truth that our culture desperately doesn't want you to know. You don't need more to be happy. You need less. Less noise, less distraction, less performance, less pretending, less accommodating other people's expectations at the expense of your own soul. The happiness you are searching for in external validation, in perfect relationships, in social media likes, in career achievements is already inside you, buried under layers of conditioning and fear. And solitude is the excavation tool that helps you dig it out. But let me be very clear about something, because this is where people often misunderstand the message. Learning to be happy alone doesn't mean you become cold, detached, or unavailable for genuine connection. Actually, the opposite happens. When you're truly comfortable in your own presence, you become more capable of real intimacy, not less. Because intimacy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires security. And security comes from having a strong relationship with yourself. Think about it practically. If your sense of worth is entirely dependent on whether someone texts you back, you'll be clingy and anxious in relationships. If your peace is contingent on having plans every weekend, you would tolerate friendships that drain you just to avoid being alone. If your joy is conditional on external circumstances constantly going well, You'll be an emotional roller coaster that exhausts everyone around you. But when you've cultivated an internal source of stability, when you've learned to generate your own peace, when you've discovered that you're actually enjoyable company for yourself, you show up in relationships completely differently. I know a therapist who works with couples, and she told me something that revolutionized how I think about relationships. She said that in 20 years of practice, she's noticed a pattern. The couples who struggle the most are the ones where neither partner has a well-developed capacity for solitude. They've merged their identity so completely that they've lost themselves in the relationship. They can't make a decision without consulting the other person. They can't enjoy an activity unless they are doing it together. They can't even have their own thoughts without wondering what their partner would think about those thoughts. On the surface, this looks like deep love and commitment, but underneath is actually deep insecurity and codependency. And it always leads to resentment, because nobody can carry the weight of being another person's entire source of happiness. It's too much pressure. The relationship becomes suffocating because it's being asked to do something it was never designed to do. Two incomplete people. But the couples who thrive, they're the ones where both people have rich internal lives. They have hobbies they pursue independently. They have thoughts and dreams that are entirely their own. They can spend an evening apart without constant texting or anxiety. They miss each other, but they don't need each other in that desperate, clinging way. And paradoxically, because they are not dependent on the relationship for their happiness, the relationship itself becomes more joyful, more free, more authentic. This brings me to something crucial I want you to understand. There's a massive difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is a state of lack. You feel isolated, disconnected, like something essential is missing. Solitude is a state of fullness. You feel complete, peaceful, connected to yourself in a way that requires no external validation. You can be surrounded by people and feel lonely. You can be completely alone and feel deeply content. The difference isn't your circumstances, it's your relationship with yourself. Let me tell you about a woman who discovered this distinction in the most unexpected way. She was a flight attendant who spent years constantly surrounded by people, passengers, crew members, airport crowds. She rarely spent more than a few hours alone, and she liked it that way, or so she thought. When the global situation in 2020 grounded flights for months, she suddenly found herself stuck in a tiny apartment with nothing but time. No work, limited social interaction, just her and her thoughts for the first time in her adult life. The first month was brutal. She felt suffocated by the silence, terrified by the stillness. She would video call anyone who would answer just to have another face on her screen. She watched endless hours of television just to hear voices that weren't her own. She felt like she was slowly disappearing without the constant reflection of herself in other people's eyes. But gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, something began to change. She started noticing things about herself. She realized she had a rhythm to her energy. Certain times of day when she felt creative. Other times when she needed rest. She discovered she actually enjoyed cooking when she wasn't doing it under pressure. She found that she had strong opinions about things she'd never bothered to articulate because she was always adapting to group consensus. She started painting, something she hadn't done since high school, and found it deeply satisfying in a way her job never had been. By the time flight resumed, she transformed so completely that she almost didn't recognize herself. She returned to work, but with completely different boundaries. She built in mandatory alone time between flights. She stopped saying yes to every social invitation out of fear of missing out. She created a life that honored both her need for connection and her need for solitude. And her relationships improved dramatically because she was no longer using them to run from herself. She could be present with people because she learned to be present with herself first. This is the journey I'm inviting you into. Not a journey away from people, but a journey toward yourself that makes your connection with others more authentic, more sustainable, more life-giving. Because here's the ultimate truth. You will never find lasting happiness in another person if you haven't first found it within yourself. You will never feel truly seen by others if you haven't first looked at yourself with honest, compassionate eyes. You will never build a life of genuine fulfillment if you're constantly looking outside yourself for permission to be happy. The path to happiness in solitude begins with a simple but profound practice. Start spending intentional time alone without distraction. Not alone while scrolling social media. Not alone while binge watching shows. Not alone while constantly texting. Actually alone with a journal, with your thoughts, with the uncomfortable feelings you've been avoiding. Start with 15 minutes a day if that's all you can handle. Sit with yourself the way you will sit with a dear friend you haven't seen in years. Ask yourself questions. What do I actually enjoy? What matters to me beyond what I've been told should matter? What am I afraid of? What am I hoping for? What have I been avoiding? And here's what will happen if you persist in this practice. You'll start to recognize patterns. You'll notice how much of your behavior is driven by fear of what others think rather than authentic desire. You'll see how many of your relationships are based on performance rather than genuine connection. You realize how much energy you've been spending trying to be who you think you should be instead of discovering who you actually are. And with that awareness comes the possibility of change. You start making different choices. You stop accepting invitations to things you don't actually want to attend just because you are afraid of being left out. You end relationships that require you to shrink yourself to make others comfortable. You pursue interests that fascinate you even if they are not trendy or impressive. You build a life that reflects your values rather than other people's expectations. And in doing so, you'll discover a quality of happiness that's not dependent on circumstances, that can be taken away by rejection or failure, that remains steady through life's inevitable ups and downs. This is the promise of learning to be happy alone. Not that you never want or need connection with others, but that your happiness won't be held hostage by whether or not you have it. Not that you become an island, isolated and self-sufficient, but that you become a whole person capable of genuine interdependence rather than toxic codependence. Not that you stop caring what others think, but that their opinions will no longer override your own inner knowing. The world needs people who have done this work. We need people who are so secure in themselves that they can speak truth even when it's unpopular. We need people who are so at peace with who they are that they don't feel threatened by others' success. We need people who are so comfortable in solitude that they can offer genuine presence to others rather than using every interaction to fill their own emptiness. We need people who have learned that happiness is an inside job, not something you extract from circumstances or other people. So I'm calling you to this journey not because it's easy, it's not because it will make you popular. It might actually make you less available for the superficial connections that dominate our culture, but because it will make you free from the tyranny of other people's opinions, free from the exhausting performance of being someone you're not, free from the constant anxiety of needing external validation to feel okay, free to build a life that's genuinely yours, aligned with your deepest values, expressing your most authentic self. The path to this freedom runs directly through your willingness to be alone, to sit with yourself without judgment, to befriend the person you've been avoiding in the mirror. And on the other side of that journey is a dimension of peace and joy that most people never access because they are too afraid to take the first step. Your happiness is not out there waiting to be found in the right relationship or achievement or circumstance. It's in here, waiting to be discovered in the quiet spaces you've been afraid to enter. The question is, are you brave enough to go looking?